This is Dylan FM, the podcast that goes deep into the work and world of Bob Dylan. If you love Dylan, you're in the right place. With your host, Craig Danieloff.
Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his songwriting. Imagine how good a book would have to be to land you in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Dylan took up the subject of literature in his Nobel lecture, but the first time Bob Dylan and great literature were linked was likely way back in the early 1970s when Michael Gray first released Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan. As Gray told us, he thought some of Dylan's long lyrics could bear the scrutiny of the analysis he was being trained to apply to literature. He began working on the book with the aim of doing just that. But Song and Dance Man not only treats Dylan's work like literature, it spends the entirety of Chapter 2 comparing it directly to the great literature of both the distant and recent pasts, from both sides of the Atlantic. As he did with folk music in Chapter 1, which we chronicled in our previous episode, Gray shows us what Dylan learned from the great literature. He names names, offers examples, and often shows us how Dylan applied what he learned over the years that followed. Discovering Dylan's influences is a somewhat unique process for a Bob Dylan fan. Many of us start out thinking that he'd created everything from scratch, and then we learn about the old folk songs that provided the early melodies or even song structures, and we find out that it wasn't just a few movie lines he quoted, but much, much more. As much as Gray takes Dylan's writing and performance apart in this book, helping us to see what he's done, perhaps how he's done it, and more importantly, why it's noteworthy, he also offers this detailed expose on the knowledge and influences that Dylan soaked up. It's immense and impressive on both of their parts. In the end, I think it leaves you standing in a different and better place when you listen to Dylan's work and when you think about the man who created it. Perhaps it also inspires you to chase down some of the sources of influence, so you yourself can see or feel more of them when you listen. Today, we chat with Michael Gray about Chapter 2 in Song and Dance Man, and we will again listen to excerpts from the book, and then Michael will react or share new and extended thoughts. The excerpts in this episode are read by Allison Rapp, a music journalist who writes for Ultimate Classic Rock, among others. You can find links to her writing and her website in the show notes. The book we're discussing is Song and Dance Man, The Art of Bob Dylan, from Volume 1 of the new 50th Anniversary Series release, which you can get at Amazon or other booksellers, in paperback or on Kindle. Of course, there are links in the show notes. If you're hearing this, you're listening to the public version of this episode. There's also an extended version. They're usually about twice as long, available to FM Plus subscribers. You can sign up for just $4.99 a month and get the full version of this and all of our episodes, plus member-only episodes as well. And to make it a great deal, that one price covers all the podcasts in the FM Podcast Network. You get extended editions, bonus episodes, and full archives for all of our shows. Plus, your subscription makes these great episodes possible. Subscribe right in the Apple Podcast app and get the longer episode right now. Or, if you use another podcast player, visit fmpods.com to sign up. Now, here's our discussion on Chapter 2 from Volume 1 of Song and Dance Man with Michael Gray. So, Chapter 1, Michael looked at Dylan and how he related to and reacted to the world of folk music. Chapter 2 dives straight into literature. It immediately gets confronted by an idea that even 50 or 60 years later at the Nobel Prize resurfaced about whether music and lyrics, when they're put together, is it still literature? Let's listen to and then talk about the first two paragraphs of the chapter.
Okay.
The folk tradition, the English literary tradition. It sounds like pigeonholing, but everything connects. A very intricate chain links the two and runs from pre-Alfredian England through to contemporary America. Because we have forgotten this, we find it hard to accept Dylan as a serious artist. He has chosen a medium we are unused to taking seriously, an inseparable mixture of music and words, and we grew up finding this a cheap and trivial formula. We should look back beyond the Elizabethan age to the time when troubadours were an important part of our culture, when that culture was orally dominated and when sophisticated art was the same in kind as the heritage of the people.
Just talk a little bit about how you, especially in context, the late 60s, early 70s, when this wasn't a common way to approach Dylan, how you even originally thought about this contradiction and then choosing to confront it.
For a start, I was very aware of this word troubadour that was bandied about, usually to do with, Greenwich Village. So I looked into this, and also I sort of knew this stuff about there having been a time when popular culture and, if you like, high culture were not so separate. Partly because of Shakespeare, he uses the language of ordinary people. And when the Globe Theatre was there in London, and people had to crowd in and stand to listen to these plays, they were peasants. They were ordinary working Londoners. And they weren't all standing there saying, what the hell does this mean? This guy's too clever for me, There was a commonality of language. And I sort of knew about that stuff. And then so I researched it a bit more and found that there were all these other specifics that I could bring into it. Because, I started the whole thing from the assumption, having listened to a lot of him, that Bob Dylan was not only an artist and someone to be taken seriously, but that quite clearly the words and the music were of equal importance to him. He has sometimes said, I just need words so that I can play the music. And at other times he said the opposite, I'm a poet and I know it. I hope I don't blow it. So, there's no point asking Bob for the answer, but it was quite clear that both were of equal and great importance in his work. And of course, what was remarkable about him in this way was the way that he brought serious words, if you like, serious words into pop music, if you will, into rock music, combining the force of poetry, as Rix calls it, with the power of rock and roll. And no one had done that before. If you like, he was, as I say somewhere else, he was like the last beat poet. In a way, he took all that Kerouac, Ginsberg stuff and stood on a stage with a guitar and recreated it, represented it in a marvelous way in the mid-60s. Yeah, so troubadour seemed really suitable. And then I found this great essay by Adrian Bell, written in, I think, 1933, which talked about all this stuff and talked about the way that people who were not highly educated tended to have more poetic modes of expression than people who were, erring on the academic side. And of course, we can all recognize that happens over and over again. And one of the things that Dylan loves is all his kind of unschooled Americana, when he was at school and writing an English essay, I'm quite sure he never used the word ain't, but in his work, he uses it all the time. That's how it is. That's a very simple example, but it's part of his great appeal, isn't it? And of course, it's part of his great appeal when he brings the blues lyric poetry of the pre-war era into his songs, because that is bringing another form of expression, which is essentially from the undereducated, untutored American population.
In the early reaction to your efforts to take him seriously, was it said out loud that that's not serious because it's song?
When I was first listening to him, he had become a pop star. He's the person you see in Don't Look Back. Pop stars are not taken seriously as literary figures, or at least they weren't then. Nobody talked about these people as artists. That's a later development. And if I'm partly responsible for it, I'm sorry. but there it is. Because everyone's an artist now, Bono is an artist.
I was thinking of examples far below Bono, and that how, now as soon as you touch a guitar or yelp into a microphone.
Yeah.
And let's go to the other end. What was your reaction to the Nobel Prize?
Well, I was against it in advance. I went to a conference at the so-called Einstein Forum in Potsdam in Germany, just outside Berlin, which unfortunately I never got a chance to look around. This conference was all about whether Dylan should get the Nobel Prize or not. It was a couple of years ahead of when he did. And I think everyone else who spoke was in favor of it. I argued against it on the grounds that, first of all, that literature was too narrow a category for him. Although there's no denying it, he is a literary figure. He is also all these other figures. He's a singer, he's a guitarist, he's a songwriter, he's a folk inheritor, and so on and so on. He's a wonderful understander of the blues and rock and roll. So I felt that calling him just a literary figure was narrowing. I also felt that the prize comes with a huge amount of money, and Bob Dylan was one of the last people to need it. And there were a good many serious, conscientious writers of novels or poems for whom it would have been a life-changing amount of money. That was all part of what I felt until the morning I heard that he had won. And of course, at that point, I was absolutely thrilled. I was just thrilled because it was selfishly, it was, if you like, a vindication of my early ploughing of this furrow. But unselfishly, I was just delighted because, he's been such a huge figure in our lifetimes. Just like, he's changed our consciousness. He's that big. So, yeah, that's my two-sided view of the Nobel Prize.
Right at the beginning of the chapter, you lay out in a paragraph or two, actually one paragraph, this very nice goal, I think, for chapter 2. And let's listen to this.
Dylan's work needs this wide historical context. It is no good just looking at it against a background of Coca-Cola, no good making vague references to kids in the 50s having increased spending power, or their cousins in the 60s getting tired of the Stars and Stripes. To go back further, beyond Presley, Guthrie, or Ginsberg, and see Dylan's art also in relation to the English literary tradition makes more sense than simply to fool about with a few sociological guesses about what's made America tick for the last half-century.
That sets the stage, and the chapter then goes on to looking at Dylan in light of a long string of literary names. The first is John Bunyan, and that sets an example. In effect, you show parallels in relationships in a long series of ways of how Dylan's work mirrors or plays off of the thinking style and approach of all of these people.
And in specific ways, I gave a series of quotes from these other writers, which more or less could be quotes from Bob Dylan. There's a Bunyan one that could be anywhere on John Wesley Harding. And I think that, and there's one from the great Robert Browning, wonderful 19th century specialist in dramatic monologues, which is another thing that Dylan has been really strong on. The dramatic monologue is where the work, the poem or the song is clearly addressed to a specific other person who never gets a word in, who can never defend themselves or get a word in. So, do you, Mr. Jones? And in the case of Browning, there's something very similar. There's a very similar knocking of someone who has studied things in theory but knows nothing about real life. And then there's that fantastic coincidence, no, can't be, between Browning's use of vandals and handles and Dylan's. You'd have to read me that, but for me to get it right off the top of my head. But you can read the Browning in Bob Dylan's voice, and it worked perfectly.
That sets me up what I wanted to ask before we get into the examples, which is all of this showing how well read and studied Dylan was, and or is it showing, kind of great minds think alike, and he came to conclusions that a bunch of other smart folks throughout history have? What's the big picture of this relationship, both in general and then to listeners, right? Because it's all very interesting to many of us who start, and perhaps you even at the beginning, who think, oh, this is all Bob. And then you slowly realize this is Bob and 5,700 other people.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is that he was very keen on English as a schoolboy. You've got to sit up close to the teacher if you want to learn anything. And he did. And his English teacher was the inspirational teacher at that amazing school that he went to, Hibbing High School, B.J. Rolfson, Boniface J. Rolfson, who I was lucky enough to meet, and who actually came to a talk of mine that I gave in Hibbing when Hibbing was still sulking about Bob Dylan having left there, and I gave a special talk at the library telling them that they should stop having an adolescent sulk themselves, and that they should appreciate that he's written lots of beautiful stuff about that part of the country. And I quoted something, several things, including from Never Say Goodbye of Planet Waves. But so that's part of it, that he was keen on English at school and has always, as we know, read books. He reads avidly, just like he watches films avidly and listens to music avidly. When he arrived in Greenwich Village, he'd already soaked up all this stuff from records he'd been played by John Pancake and others in Minnesota, and stuff he'd heard on the radio in the middle of the night, coming all the way up from somewhere in Louisiana. He was insatiable as a sort of sponge. And so that's part of it. As for the great minds think alike stuff, well, yeah, I mean, obviously there are general ways in which that's bound to be the case. But great minds, do they think alike? I mean, people in different ages think very different things. I mean, just to take one example, which does relate to what we're talking about here, I hope. Before the age of the Romantics, the Romantic poets, at the cusp, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, before Wordsworth and so on, people didn't appreciate nature in at all the same way that they did afterwards. People thought mountains were ghastly, awful things. No one saw any beauty in them, or if they did, they didn't write a poem about it. So, people do feel differently in different ages. So great minds may think alike, but I don't. I think in the case, for example, of the Browning Subterranean Homesick Blues, how can that not be directly that he has come across that poem and just been entranced by those rhyming words?
It is interesting now that we think of him as a borrower or a reuser so centrally, to look back and find all these places where it started. I mean, obviously you've been pointing this out, for 50 years, but it isn't the way people think of him. And it is a process people go through individually or collectively as it's been discovered. Well, let's look at one of the first examples about Bunyan where you do this. This is a section early in Ch.2.
Bunyan, then, is very much Dylan's forebear, and there are many and noticeable similarities of language in their work. It is from Bunyan, and certainly not from any rock and roll vocabulary, that Dylan gets this great and typical phrase from Joey on the Desire album. God's in heaven, overlooking his preserve. And isn't this, for example, instantly recognizable as a line from the Dylan of the John Wesley Harding album? Pray, who are your kindred there, if a man may be so bold. But it is not Bob Dylan, it is Christian in Pilgrim's Progress. And doesn't this comply almost exactly in rhythm and vocabularative tone? Oh, what dear daughter beneath the sun could treat a father so, to wait upon him hand and foot and always answer no? Thus, Dylan's Tears of Rage, which also illustrates, as do many other Dylan songs, its creator's concern for salvation. In terms of the parallels with Bunyan, this is the nearest to a merely coincidental one, and yet even here, coincidence is perhaps not the right word.
So that's a deep example of what you're talking about, where the soaking of influence is so thorough that it becomes difficult to distinguish between the two.
Yeah. The salvation thing, of course, brings us to the other great commonality between Dylan and all these older people, and that is a familiarity with the language of the Bible, the King James Bible. When he was asked in 1969 by Rolling Stone about a lot of stuff, there was an assumption in the questioning that he wasn't interested in something like the Bible. And Dylan says, "How do you know I don't read the Bible?" And then when he has his born-again conversion, he says, I'd always read the Bible as literature, but it never occurred to me until now to take it on another level. So, this runs through everything because the Bible was the book that people had. Once they were allowed to have it in English, and for many, many, many years in Britain, people who went to church, peasants, were not allowed to hear it in English. They had to hear it in Latin, which they didn't understand a word of. But once they were allowed to hear the Bible in English, then, it just soaked into everybody's consciousness and everybody's work.
So this interplay between Dylan, in this case, Bunyan, it kind of opens the door to a lot of what Dylan's studies became in over 50 years. I mean, certainly not all, but a lot of it is finding these relationships, discussing Dylan in context. How should Dylan listeners apply this? In other words, is this interesting? Is it set to expand what one can understand is coming from Dylan? Is it about an introduction to these people to go learn what they're about, to have your own context? What's the big value that comes out of identifying these?
It enriches Dylan's work for me and obviously for a number of other people. Look at Scott Wormuth's work on Chronicles. Well, now, Chronicles as an example where Dylan is actually interweaving many sentences from, well, in particular, Jack London, but many, many, many people into that semi-fictional work. What could be more interesting than finding that all that has been done? Whether you then rush off and decide that it's cheating, or whether you decide that actually it must have been a great deal more work for Dylan to inbuild those things so sneakily than it would have been to just write blah, blah, blah himself, in the way that it rather seems to me he has done with the philosophy of modern song. So, if you're that way inclined, of course it's enriching. I mean, I loved it when I found that Browning Vandals, Handels, Candles thing. But for some people, they just want to enjoy Bob, and they hate people like me analyzing it. I think there's what I've always wanted to stress in that regard is the difference between being a critic and being an interpreter. I've tried to never interpret him. That is to say, like Weberman did, when he sings lady, he means oligarch, that sort of stuff. I mean, that's just rubbish, Interpreting him, this song is about so-and-so. Well, it may be, but there's a great deal more to a work of art than it's about, Mona Lisa, it's about whether she has an enigmatic smile. No, it's a work of art and it has a great complexity to it, or it wouldn't be so hard to see it at the Louvre. So, but some people they just want to get off on Bob. And they don't care about any of this. They're the people who used to stand up near the front in his concerts and shout, "Maggie's Farm." That's what they wanted, you know. They just wanted Bob to rock and roll. And the fact is that he does rock and roll, but he used to do it rather better than most people because there was more in the words. And there was more in the words because of all this other stuff, of the kind of complex, intelligent, well-read guy that Bob Dylan has always been.
I think the middle ground, which is where it's most useful, is in giving resonance to lots of these phrases, that they're impactful on their own, and they obviously make sense in the context of the song or strike us as art in the right way. But to all of a sudden know that there's echoes or innuendo or something that if you know it, you can bring to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's fundamentally what your book does. I don't know the first time I read it or parts of it, but to all of a sudden realize that it's not just, it was incredibly enjoyable on the surface with what I brought to it, but to all of a sudden discover that extra stuff and these other relationships and get that context is, I think, what the whole rest of this chapter does. It starts to show that this isn't, and casual fans probably have heard of one or two of these things. You know, this song came from that song, or, you know, so even the very old one. But to now know it's not just, you know, he remembered, you know, an old Scottish ballad and wrote new words to the tune. But this kind of sophistication, I think, is why the book has been received the way it did. Let's look at another one of these Bunyan ones, where you actually go further on this idea of salvation, which is the second point that this starts to illustrate, which is it's not just this line or this stanza is about that, but there's recurring themes that go over songs and albums and over maybe a lifetime of the work, and that those are there too. And that becomes a whole new level. So here you're talking about the issue of salvation that you mentioned before.
All this search for the quintessential man comes into an intelligent concern for salvation, a concern Dylan stands by in much of his work. It is there in Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, in the simple line, "It is almost just a passing remark, gave her my heart, but she wanted my soul," and in his tender appreciative to Ramona, "Your cracked country lips I still wish to kiss, as to be by the strength of your skin. Your magnetic movements still capture the minutes I'm in." That strength is felt by him. It implies a given moral strength, a Laurentian awareness of the real derived from an alertness of the physical senses. Through the abrasive intelligence of work invested with such values, Dylan has changed a generation, has made it more sensitive to what is enhancing and what is impoverishing. It is as much as the artist can do.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know quite what to say about it. Obviously, not everyone is sensitive, and not everyone feels closer to God as a result of considering questions of salvation. But Dylan's very fierce on this very early on. You know, think of that moment in Don't Look Back where he's being interviewed by the Time magazine guy. And Dylan is the hippest person on the planet at that point. He's very young, and yet everyone is telling him he's, it.
Thanks for listening to this part of this episode. We hope you'll consider becoming an FM Plus subscriber to hear the full version of this and all of our shows. Sign up in the Apple Podcasts app or at fmpods.com.
Did you enjoy this show? Then please rate this podcast and leave a review. It really helps. Also, sign up for 7 Days, our free weekly newsletter that puts all the top Bob Dylan news and links into your inbox every Sunday. Use the link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.